All right, welcome to our Friday office hour. Hope you had a nice spring break. And as you know, next week I'll post the third exam. So the third exam is much like the first exam in that it's open notes. And so we're not using the Proctorio. Okay, so it's just like a regular quiz. It's open notes, open textbook, open resources, and 50 questions. So, and you can take it anytime during next week, as long as it's completed by Sunday at 11:59. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at the third study guide. And we kind of talked a little bit, but I didn't have the study guide online for me to use. So I have it here so we can quickly fill out the things that we talked about earlier, like the definition of a species. So a species are groups of similar individuals that share similar characteristics and can interbreed. So let's see, I'm gonna cut and paste so it'll be faster. So groups of similar individuals that share similar characteristics and can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. Now I want to clarify that because we can make some other organisms like a horse and a donkey breed, but their offspring are not, cannot themselves breed. They're not fertile. So so that's what would distinguish, those are two separate species, a horse and a mule. And even though they can produce an offspring, it's not fertile. And a lot of times they don't produce viable offspring, meaning they die. Who is known as the father of evolution? Of course, that is Charles Darwin. And what was the name of the manuscript in 1859? So let me put this down. Oh, yeah. I have to just... So the father of evolution is Charles Darwin. Maybe I'll put it down here. And the manuscript is On the Origin of Species by means of a process called natural selection. Okay. So we talked about that. So here we go. What are the four postulates that this theory is based on? And that's, from the notes pretty much. And the first thing is that individuals within a population, and remember, population is same species, same place, same time, that live together, and so this population has to have certain characteristics in order for evolution to occur. They have to be varied. There has to be variability in the population. They can't all be the same. And so the population has to differ from each other, or each individual members differ from each other. And some of these differences, some of them must be able to be passed from parent to offspring. Some individuals can be more successful and survive be more likely to survive than others based on those characteristics. And the, you know, whether an individual lives or dies is determined, is not by chance or luck. Okay, it depends on these characteristics. And then when certain individuals have traits that make it more advantageous or make them more likely to survive and be able to reproduce, then that's called natural selection. All right, so let me see if I can get this on here. I'm going to see if I can put the 4 postulates. All right. Okay. So evolution. So evolution is change over time within a population, and change in the gene pool. And so there are 5 different evidences for evolution. So do you remember what some of those are? Okay. So what are some? Artificial selection, right? That we can show evolution in populations by doing it artificially. So if we can do it artificially, meaning we choose and we select those individuals that will survive and not, that's, you know, evidence that, hey, it can happen. All right, so what else do we have? Similar anatomy, right? So we can compare the anatomy of very different organisms, and we find similar anatomical structures. We call them homologous structures, that they're very similar. Like if we look at the forelimbs of certain mammals and forelimbs of birds, very different organisms, but they have the same bones in it. Okay. What else? Oh, and also with anatomy, that there are some vestigial um, structures, meaning that some organisms no longer has a function for those structures, but they provide function in other organisms. So a remnant of possible um, relationships between populations. Hey, glad you could make it. All right, so we're talking about, and so we're filling out our study guide as we go, and some other evidences of evolution. Fossils, right? So we could look at fossil records and see that, oh, there are older organisms that died and left their fossils, and that can be intermediate between several species to show that species do change over time. There's a couple other things. I'm going to list them all. Molecular bio, right? So very different organisms all share similar chemicals in their body and similar molecules. And so this, you know, relatedness is a possible point of evidence. All right, and there's one more. What was the last one? Oh, the embryology. So development, if we look at the development of embryos and fetuses, we see that the early stages of development between very different organisms have very similar, they look very similar when in the embryology or the development. So these are all evidences of, why is it all evidences of evolution. So, I don't know why it's. Just trying to make it look nice. Okay, why is this not 5? Okay, something like that. Artificial selection, fossil record, comparative anatomy, similar embryology, molecular biology. Okay, that's good. This next one talks, we already talked about homologous structures above, that they're similar in structure, but even though they may function differently. So we may have an organism that, so we use the example of the mammal and the bird. One uses it to fly, one uses it to maybe run, but the bones are the same. So analogous structures are those that might have the same function. Structures that may be similar in function, but be very different in structure. I should say analogous structures equal. So an example would be a bird wing and a butterfly wing. Okay, so they both function to fly, but they're very different in structure, right? One has bones, one has membranes and connective tissue and things like that. Whereas we've already discussed homologous structures are anatomically similar, but may have different functions. So maybe I'll okay, there you go. Hardy and Weinberg, these are scientists that looked at population population genetics, or the study of evolution in populations, and they kind of took a different view. Wait, let me put this here. Of how to go about looking at populations and evolution. So they looked at populations that don't evolve, and they used a mathematical formula. So they made this mathematical formula or model of a population not evolving. And then when they look at data from like real populations, they can compare it to a population that doesn't evolve. So it's kind of like a different way to look at evolution and to see whether a population is in fact evolving. And again, they do it by comparing it to a population that doesn't evolve. So there are 5 conditions in order for a population to what they call remain in equilibrium. And so when it's in equilibrium, it means it's not evolving. So let's take a look. So these are the 5 conditions for a population to not evolve. So first of all, there has to be no mutation in that population. No gene flow, meaning no genes that enter or exit that population. We can't have other, organisms or individuals coming in and changing the genes in that population. The population has to be really large. And there has to be random mating, meaning there can't be certain characteristics that give an individual an advantage, or there can't be something that is desirable above somebody else. Okay, so mating is random. Okay, there's no choice, there's no preference or anything. And there's no natural selection, so that all individuals reproduce with equal success. Now, of course, this doesn't really exist, but if we look at a population that has met these conditions, that population won't evolve. And there's a formula, and in lab, either you did this or you're going to do it. Did you guys do it already with the Hardy-Weinberg principle? So what you were doing is you were doing experiments. I think you did it already, where you had to like either pick up beans or something, and then you make calculations about that population, and then you compare those numbers to a population that's not evolving, which is the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Does that make sense? Yeah, yeah. So that's what you were doing there, is you were seeing if your population evolved numerically, mathematically, and then compare it to a population that does not evolve and follows these characteristics. All right. So lastly, some mechanisms for evolution in populations. So it's kind of, we're talking about very similar things. So what are they? 4 mechanisms for evolution. And okay, let me see. I wonder if I have that list. All right, so, oh, here it is. Mechanisms for evolution. And I'm just going to list them here. Oops, darn. Okay, we want that. All right, so these are the 4 mechanisms for evolution. Okay. Natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, and mutations. So obviously the list above is if a population isn't evolving. The one below is for a population that is evolving. And so we see these things: natural selection, that's the preference or a selection of characteristics that give some individuals in a population an advantage. Okay, so that's what natural selection is, right? So, whether it be mating or just, a gene that makes someone more resistant to cold. So if a storm comes, and the people those who don't have that gene will die, so whatever it is that gives you an advantage in a population, that's natural selection. So let me fix this. Okay. And genetic drift. So this is looking at the genes in a population. And because sometimes there's random things that happen in a population, and it's totally due to chance. Sometimes there's a disaster and something catastrophic, let's say, and like a tsunami or something, and it wipes out a bunch of individuals. It's going to change. That population is going to evolve or change after that. So, and that's called genetic drift. Now there's a bottleneck effect there's usually, like I just mentioned, an event that happens, and then you get, it's random and due to chance. And then there's something with organisms leave the population, and so you can and that's kind of random too. There's gene flow, so individuals can enter and join the population. That would change the population genetics, and you can get evolution. And then mutations, so you can get the creation of new genes or alleles just by maybe environmental things, or whatever the cause is that causes your genes to mutate or to change. All right. All right. So, okay, so that's that. Let's go. And then the last 3 chapters are just on diversity. So, deals with starting small. We looked at viruses and bacteria, protists, single-celled organisms, and fungi. And then we look at plants, and then animals. So let me grab something else. So let's take a look at chapter 13. So this kind of includes some things from earlier, right? Our early chapter, when we talked about systematics and then the 3 domains of life. So we talked about that early at the beginning of the semester. So we kind of revisit that again as we look at different organisms and how to categorize these organisms. So Carolus Linnaeus, and he was a Swedish biologist, and he's the one who came up with the 2-name way of scientifically categorizing organisms. All right, the 2-part, let me get the exact wording. Okay. And how do you organize all these living things so that we can talk about them and study them? And so number 10 is classify human, starting with domain and ending with species. I think we did this, or maybe not. But so in the notes, we do that, and we start with, and you may want to use the mnemonic that begins with domain. So we could say this is what I learned. All right, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay, so you make some kind of sentence that has the beginning of each letter, and to remember the order in which organisms can be classified. So classification is, we start with the largest group. Okay, so let's see. All right, so we start with the largest group, which is domain. And this contains, what you do is you take all living things and you put them in 3 groups because there are 3 domains. So how do we separate all living things into 3 groups? And this is the task of someone who does systematics. All right, so the domain, and we're doing a human. We're classifying a human. We are in the domain eukarya. The other domains are bacteria and archaea, right? Or eubacteria or archaea. So we're in the domain eukarya. We're in the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata. There's a subphylum there, and in each one of there's subphylums, subclasses, and etc. But we're in the phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominidae, genus Homo, species Sapiens. And notice genus is always capitalized, species is always lowercase. All right, and so that is classification of a human. And from which classification categories is a scientific name derived or determined? So which 2 classification groupings do we determine the genus, the scientific name? You know? Correct, genus and species. Okay, very good. All right, so what is phylogeny? So phylogeny, it's looking at what? Evolutionary history, good. So it's looking at the relationship kind of between organisms. Okay. Oh. Hold on, I'm looking for something. Let me grab something. Okay, and then what is systematics? Systematics. Let's see, let me grab phylogeny. Equals evolutionary. History. Oops. Okay, hold on, let me grab something else. Okay. All right. So systematics then is yeah. So well, it's a branch of biology. Let's see. That deals with classification of living things. And through this classification, then we can attempt to reconstruct phylogeny by looking at, classification. So they kind of go hand in hand. Okay, compare contrast organisms in bacteria and archaea. Oh, and I did. You're right. I did define it as it deals classification, and I'll put them reconstructing phylogeny. Okay. So how do we tell the difference between bacteria and archaea? So they're very similar because they're both prokaryotic. So both are prokaryotic cells, okay, or organisms, single cell. Single cell. But what are their differences? So this is the compare part. All right, they have different, they differ in their components, okay, what their cell walls are made up of. They have different organelles made of different components. Yeah, and then the way they metabolize and make things is different. Okay, differ in composition. I'll say structural composition. Composition, like the cell walls. And other organelles. And differ in how about in the way they make proteins? Okay, that's good. All right. What are the shapes in prokaryotes? All right, some are like balls, like spheres. Good. Spheres, rods, and what's the last one? They're kind of like little twisty corkscrews. Yeah. So that's how and they're super tiny, obviously, versus eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are very much larger. So what are some bacteria beneficial and which are harmful? And I think I just listed a bunch in the or in the book and on the notes. Okay, so I'll let you do that. So bacteria are beneficial in what ways? They make stuff. We can make food from it. Yogurt, for example, bacteria cultures, and that give it its flavor. Cheese. Okay. We have bacteria in our gut, in our colon, that make and synthesize vitamins for us. And so that's important. So sometimes when you take too many antibiotics, okay, some people take a lot of antibiotics. You should avoid antibiotics when possible. So, you know, when you have a cold or something and you're a little sick, you have to, you know, don't just take antibiotics anytime because they kill your regular happy bacteria, right? So we have natural bacteria in our digestive system, in our colon, that do things for us. And when you just take a lot of antibiotics, you kill those. And sometimes it leaves like an opening where bad bacteria can come in and now reside, because normally our good bacteria take up space. They fill a niche, what we call in our digestive system, that's beneficial. So we have to be careful. Antibiotics are not always good. So you always, you know, before you take antibiotics, you try to get it cultured, and so you can identify the bacteria if possible. Because most colds and illnesses are due to viruses, which antibiotics don't fight at all. All right, describe the structure of a virus. Now, there's also bad bacteria. that causes disease and tetanus and gonorrhea and syphilis and the plague and lots of different things, and strep throat, right? So all these are caused by these bacteria. So viruses, I'm not going to fill it all in. Viruses are very simple in structure. They do have genetic material, so they have RNA or sometimes DNA, depending on the virus, and it's just surrounded by a protein coat. But it can't reproduce on its own. Okay, it needs a host cell. So that's the question: are viruses living? If they're not living, and the thing says viruses are not living, do you agree or disagree? So, if you think they are not living and you agree with that statement, one of the reasons is that it needs a host to reproduce. It can't reproduce on its own. And if you don't agree with it and you think they are living, I mean, they have genetic material. So does that make something living? All right. Some viruses that infect humans, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. Herpes is a virus. Okay. There's a virus that causes cervical cancer. That's just went out of my mind. What is it called? It's called human papilloma virus, HPV. There, it came to me. List some viruses. Here's some viruses. I'm going to put it here. HPV, human papilloma virus. Okay. Okay, there we go. Protists. Protists are very simple, single-celled organisms. Let me grab that one. Hold on. Okay, so let's get the protists and the fungi. Okay, so are they prokaryotic or eukaryotic protists? Prokaryotic or eukaryotic? Eukaryotic, good. So, and let's see what else. So most are single cell. There's lots of different ones. It's asked for how they're beneficial. So what are some beneficial ones? Algae. So algae are photosynthetic. They provide food and nutrients to other organisms. And there's different types of algae, and they produce, what else? They're photosynthetic, so they produce oxygen too. So let's see, and how are they harmful? So what's some harmful? Let me get this here. Well, beneficial algae. Okay, and all those things they said they provide. And then harmful ones, let's see, what did I put? Some cause diseases, like causing, yeah, like what kind of diseases? Let's see. Yeah, they can attack crops. You know that white stuff on grapes that sometimes we get? the mildew on it. Okay. Let's see, disease causes. So what are some diseases? There's like STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, trichomonas, vaginalis, giardia from tainted water. You can get these little protists, parasites that enter your body. Let's see. Dysentery by amoeba, a malaria. African sleeping sickness, right? Crops. Downy mildew. Grapes. Hate that mildew on grapes. Okay, etc. So lots of bad things it can cause. All right. How do fungi obtain nutrients? How do they? You know how they do it? They absorb it. Absorption. So they digest, or they use enzymes to break down material that are small, and then they absorb it across them. And this is all done outside of the body. Absorption through the body wall. Okay, so what are the 5 types of fungi? And give an example of each. So I'll just cut and paste that. Oops, this was darn. Why does it do that? I hate when it just does it. Okay, so there. Okay, and oops. Okay, mushrooms, bread mold, and then other types of fungi. All right, how are we doing? So plants, so if we don't finish today, we can finish on next Friday. Okay, it's all pretty straightforward, right? So the life cycle of plants and alternation of generations. This is just a way that plants, they alternate their life cycle, or they spend different parts of their life as different organisms. Okay, good. You finished it. Very good. And so, okay, you guys are done? Okay, so this is like for the class. So the plants are cool in that they have 2 different like body structures. What are the 2 body structures? Okay, so we'll leave some of it for next Friday too. But because I need to finish just a little early because I have to do something. I have another office hour at 1. So we'll quit a little early. You guys are awesome. But the cool thing about the plants, maybe we'll just finish here, the alternation of generations. Let me bring up the little picture. Do I have an alternation? Oh, I do have an alternation. So what are the 2 forms of different 2 organisms? Uh-oh. So the two like different body forms is the sporophyte and the gametophyte. So plants alternate between these two types of organism, but it's the same organism. So they have two different like body forms. The first one is the gametophyte makes gametes. All right, so the gametophyte, um, those are the ones that are going to make the eggs and the sperm. And so when they make the egg and sperm, it comes together to form the second form, which is the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is diploid, okay, and the gametophytes are usually haploid. Okay, so here's the gametophytes here, and the sporophytes. So the gametophytes are haploid, meaning half the amount of chromosomes. They form the egg and sperm, and then the egg and sperm come together to form, fertilize, and then form the sporophyte. And so the sporophyte is diploid. And then the sporophyte is going to undergo meiosis. You're going to get gametophytes again, which then produce gametes, which come together, which form the sporophyte again. And so we're different in that we just have one body form, but cells within our bodies make the gametes. And so, you know, kind of a way to look at it is if we were a plant, we would have our regular form, which is us, and we're the diploid form. So we're like the sporophyte. But then if we actually, it's like if our ovaries and our testes left our bodies and became independent structures and independent organisms, and then they in turn would produce gametes, right? So it's like if our ovaries and our testes became like separate structures outside of our body, then that would be kind of a similar way to look at it as gametophytes and sporophytes. Does that make sense? So that's that alternation of generation. And the rest of the questions are really, you know, like list this, what are the characteristics, and that can be pulled, as you guys have already done, from the notes. And so you guys are in good shape. You have your notes. You can go ahead and take the exams when it becomes available. And it shouldn't be that difficult. Okay, we're going to finish here. Hey, you guys, thanks for coming, because it would be really boring if it was just me by myself. And I appreciate I will be posting this. And thank you for coming. Have a good week next week, and you have a good trip. I know. How do you pronounce your name? Cyan? 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 Really close, but no cigar. Not good. Hey, I know you're leaving, so you have a nice trip, as nice as it can be, and I hope everything works out okay. All right, guys. I'll talk to you later.